Welcome to Kyoge Win at the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of Saskatchewan. My name is Marilyn and I have the honor today of interviewing artist Christi Belcourt and our cultural advisor Maria Campbell as we discuss Christi's new addition to the law library at the University of Saskatchewan. So hi.
Hi.
I'm so happy to just have a comfortable visit today and say, okay, how are we going to start this? So start with, thank you for smudging us, Christi. Thank you for that. And just nanaskaman anoch kagisigak, happy, grateful, thankful to start our day in a good way and have a day to start. And I was thinking maybe what we could do is I'd like, Christi, for you to talk about the painting and talk about what's in it so that when people are looking at it, they get a real sense of sort of what am I seeing here?
Well, the painting is called Every Dot a Prayer for the Saskatchewan Rivers, as you guys know, and it's a painting that speaks to the love that all of us have for the Saskatchewan Rivers, both of them, the north and the south. And also the very, very long relationship that's within our blood memory, that our ancestors had, that other nations have had with the Saskatchewan Rivers, and our relatives, all of our animals and plant relatives, the relationships that they have had for tens of thousands of years. You know, I always think about those 90 million buffalo that lived, you know, along with us, our people, our Indigenous people, we're numbered in the 90 millions before contact. And to think that the Buffalo Nation's genocide coincided with our own, out of no fault of their own, only because of the hatred of us.
In less than 100 years.
In less than 100 years, because they wanted our land and they wanted our waters. And that's why the Buffalo Nation had to suffer in that way for us. And I think about their relationship with the river. The central fish that's depicted in the painting is the sturgeon. The sturgeon is the lake sturgeon species. That is now listed on the endangered species list and has been extirpated from many parts of the river. The river is being dammed all over, overused for agriculture, and this need for us to subjugate the river for our own benefits has detrimental effects for future generations of all species, including our own. The sturgeon is a very sacred fish, a very sacred being, and the frogs are included in there based on a dream that I had about frogs and the sturgeon, with a relationship that they had together that has nothing to do with us. In my dream, the sturgeon told me, I miss the frogs. And then I looked up on Google, the Menominee people have within their teachings a belief that the sturgeon will wait for the frogs to sing before they'll return to spawn. And so this is a relationship that they've had for tens of thousands of years, which is not based on predator-prey or, you know, all of those misguided sort of beliefs that people have about the natural world, but more in line with the way that our people think about the natural world and how we must live on the earth. I think about natural law and sacred law in terms of that it governs us, we don't govern it. So when we think about the land and we think about the types of governance that we had in our communities. For example, it wasn't just the buffalo hunts that we had trapline governance, which was completely different. That, you know, and you have to think about how we would behave as a community, supporting one another. How did we have to live? How did the earth govern us? And we lived within those laws, not the other way around. The idea that people now think that they can manage natural resources is what's that word, antithetical to what we have known for tens of thousands of years of how to live here. I think about when the Europeans first came here, they wrote within their journals that the fish were so thick they could walk on the backs of them across the rivers. The water was so clean that you could drink it out of any lake, any river. And you know, our friend Isaac Murdoch, he always says his measure of success is, can he dip his cup into a river and drink that water? You know, that's a measure of success. So this painting includes a lot of depictions of plants and animals, such as the barn swallow, which is now listed on the endangered species list. It depicts a lot of the plants that I feel personally connected to based on our experience with our lodge and with the Gabriel's Crossing and our experience on that part of the river. And it has stories in there. And there's a lot of elements. Every single element in there has some kind of a meaning. And it could be used, if we understood the stories of our people, then we'll understand the painting a lot more. And even I am always learning. I will be a lifelong learner of the earth. So there's a lot of medicines that I depict in there, but I don't necessarily know how to use. I've just heard how they're used. So it's about respect, it's about love for the river, and it's about understanding our sacred responsibility for water, and that we come to this earth surrounded in water. We are born into water, and water is our first element that we come into real contact with, to think about how the energy of our mothers moves through that water, how the energy of life moves through that water. And all species that are born into water or surrounded by water experience the same things. So that's basically what I had sort of
You know,
said.
when you were talking about that's what you were thinking when you were painting. And when I look at it, I think about stories with each one of those, and in the stories, how our teachings and our laws are wrapped up in each one of those, and even our histories are in the sturgeon, for example. You know, all of the oral history that's in the sturgeon, the law that's in the sturgeon, you know, the treaties between animals. And when we think about treaties, we think of treaties between people, and in the Americas we think that the treaties are between First Nations and non-Indigenous people. But we don't, you know, as Canadians, we don't understand that there were treaties within animal worlds, between animals, and even between people and animals, because we didn't grow up with Atayokayona, those what are called the sacred stories that have laws in them. And you mentioned the agreements between, you know, for example, the sturgeon and the frogs. You know, there's a story, and I can't remember the story. I was trying to when you were talking about that. But there's a story about Wisakecha or Nanabush or any one of those tricksters in most Algonquin stories. That in that story, there's something that happens between Wisakecha and what he does to the sturgeon and what the frogs do, so that the frogs end up with a treaty between them, because that's the only way that they can trick him or outsmart him. And I wished I could remember what the story is, because I remember hearing it when I was a kid, when we, you know, especially when we were camped along the river and people were talking about sturgeon. But those stories existed all over in those. You know, in the stories it says that when the people and the animals spoke the same language, you know, and their kinship was that tight, and sometimes they had to work together to out-trick Wisakecha, or sometimes he had to work with one of them or one of the plants species in order to be able to, because what he was put on earth for in those stories was to go and make laws for the people to live by. he was the grandchild of the first grandmother who was the lawkeeper, and she sent him out to do that. That was his work. You know, when we think about him as Indigenous people, we think about him as the trickster. I mean, that's become such a cliche and a stereotype because it takes away that he was a teacher, a healer, and a lawmaker. You know, and that our first treaties with each other and with, because in Wakuftuin that means everything, which is, you know, all of that. If you put people in that picture, would have been, you know, all of them would have been there. That's what that means, and the interconnectedness. But in that interconnectedness is where those laws and protocols and responsibilities and obligations were, so that you would know how you were supposed to live with each other. When you talked about, you know, there were so many fish that you could walk across. Well, probably in those sacred stories, there's a story about how they were blocking and damming the rivers. So what did they have to do in order for them to be able to make room for other species that were in the water? Like, there's a story for everything. The old saying is that in the Atayokeona and about Wissakecha, there's as many stories as there's snowflakes, because you tell those stories in the winter. Eh? So I think about that when you were talking about that, and if I were using this, you know, just like this is what I used when I was doing a seminar class in here, talking about Indigenous law. I would say, what do you think those two old ladies over there represent? You know, they've just met each other, and there's Wakuhtu, and there's the community, and there's us as people. What do you think they're having a meeting about? Because those were the people who policed the community. And if the community was out of hand, those were probably the two midwives. You know, that would have been what they'd be called. But they were the ones who determined, because they knew the inside story in everybody's family. They knew what was happening, and so they would meet and decide, how are we going to deal with Marilyn and her partner? Mm-hmm. You know, whatever. They would determine that, and then sit down with the elders or their council and say, we have to deal with this in the community. And in the community, this could be what we in English should call the source. This is where the stories are, those stories that contain those laws, and people would come in and sit down. That's what Kiogewin means. But today we say Kiogewin is visiting, or in history books they say these people sat around and gossiped a lot, especially the women, because people were laughing, and it looked like they were gossiping, but really that was how they discussed what was happening in the community, because they were never direct. Our people are still not direct today. Mm-hmm. You know, somebody like us who are quite direct, people would say it's because they're part white. Mm-hmm. So we don't practice, or we're more modern. We don't practice that old way of you don't speak directly about something, because you're going to make it uncomfortable, and you're closing the space to be able to have a good conversation. So usually they would go to this place, which in English we call the source, where the stories are, and somebody would tell a story, and the story had to do with, you know, maybe it was the treaty between the frogs and the sturgeon, and there is, which is what we were talking about this morning, about that plant, mm-hmm. you know, that you dreamt about. Mm-hmm. I was telling her a story about, remember the transcripts you told me about sweetgrass? Mm-hmm. Anyway, I was going through it. I've been looking for all of the pieces for this story for 52 years, if you can believe, since I did those interviews with Big Bear's daughter-in-law, to try and figure out what she was talking about, because I kind of vaguely knew, but I didn't. And in all of the research, I finally found the last two pieces that I think I need to be able to tell that story, that I figured out. And so we were talking about a plant that that she had dreamt about. She was telling me about this plant she dreamt about, and she finally was getting all of the pieces after how many years?
25.
25 years, about medicines, which is what she works with when she's painting. And while she was telling me this story, I remembered when I worked with Lubicon, the Lubicon Cree, which was in the 90s. And Bernard one day said, this was the chief, he said, let's go pick medicine today. He said, we're going to go out in the water. And he said, wear, rubbers or something. Don't wear boots because you'll fill up with water. We have to go in the water. Because she was telling me in the dream, she was digging around and she was all covered with mud trying to pull this plant out. Anyway, we went out and we were lucky we found it in the water about that deep. So I only had to keep my head up, but I could dig around. And make a long story short, I don't use medicine, but I pick medicine for people that do. This old man needed medicine, so I picked it for him. And all kinds of stuff has happened to me over this medicine. Other people want it, and I go pick it, but I don't know anything about it. And when she was telling me this,
it's the same
this
medicine.
morning, now
I intimately know that plant.
Now I know that plant. That's what that plant was. I've never really thought about it. I was telling her that he used to, the one old elder I picked it for, would dry the root and he'd smash it up really good, grind it, and then he'd put something in it. I didn't pay attention to what it was, and then he'd pour it into a red bandana that he'd give, because he'd make medicine for somebody who had migraines, and they'd either tie it this way on their head or they'd tie it this way. But I didn't really know what it was for, and then she met somebody about 10 years ago that told her that this was the medicine that she used for migraine headaches.
With the red bandana.
With the red bandana.
So it's like it's like validating each other. We were talking this morning too about in our conversation over tea about traditional burns of the land.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that before.
And how that goes along with ceremony. And when you take out one piece, it feels empty, And so the idea that we can talk about stories and traditional law only really comes alive
if you have the story.
If we have the story, if we have the
ceremony and
if
the
we're
songs.
living it. We're living
Otherwise, it's an empty thing, and you have no context for why did we burn? Well, I guess we burned because we had to keep the yard clean or to keep the fire, make sure we didn't have a fire. And somebody said, well, why can't they do that again, start burning? Somebody was having this stereotypical conversation about people don't keep their yards clean. Well, if there's no ceremony, if they don't have the ceremony, there's no purpose to do that because it's against the law to have burns. So then you decide that, well, we did this for a reason, and you start to have the burn again, but you don't have the ceremony. You get everybody all upset because you're setting places on fire, and you become known as a firebug. But your memory tells you that there was a reason why we did that. And there was all kinds of reasons. It was to make sure that the medicines grew. It was to make sure it was part of your harvesting. It's like you get your ground ready to put your rye or whatever it is that they grow, winter wheat or something. You would have your fires so that you could pop the seeds faster, and you'd have fresh berries and more berries, and there was all sorts of reasons. But it was also our spring ceremony where you'd have a big feast, and
the community's coming together after winter.
And
it's the second
those
spring.
ceremonies were held all over. They were almost like fertility ceremonies in every culture in the world. Same thing. So the law doesn't mean anything if you don't have all of those things.
When people say, well, what is Indigenous law? Like, what do you mean by that? What's natural law? And how do you take somebody from 0 to 60 on what is natural law? So they're related, and the sturgeon wait until they have a clean place to spawn, and the fish sing for them, and that's when they leave their eggs.
Or the frogs.
The frogs. And the frogs are singing. Reg Crowshoe teaches that singing, at the end of treaty signing, singing was, these are my words, not his, but sort of the wax seal on the treaty. That was here's our signatures. Having one of our ancestors touch the end of a pencil while a mark was made on a document they couldn't read and didn't understand, it didn't reflect all of the work they had put into putting this treaty together so that their children would be looked after in the future. It was really interesting, and now you're talking about that again in terms of we have treaties amongst each other for a very long time, and we've been using singing to make treaties for a very long time. And he actually said that when you go out to hunt a buffalo, or you go out to hunt at all, there's a song that you sing in order to get the license spiritually to go and take a life. Taking a life is such a big deal that you do that. Gladys Wapass teaches that when you go to pick your medicines, you introduce yourself. You don't just show up and take what you want. You don't harvest without knowledge. You don't harvest without purpose. And that
that's like when we acknowledge ourselves and our territory, we give our name and we to each other.
So why are we doing that? Right?
That's part of the protocol of hunting and picking medicine.
So visiting like this is reminding us about what's going on in there. Your painting was sung into the library last night by Joseph, which was...
And he wasn't told to sing.
And he wasn't. It just set up like that. It was so beautiful. So Maria, you teach that we all bring a piece of the puzzle, and that here's Christi's contribution to what I'm piece. Right. This is, you know, when you're making a puzzle and all of a sudden a big piece comes together, and then you go, oh, that's where I'm going, and all of a sudden the other little pieces start to come. That's what I felt happened. How did you feel about that?
Oh, for sure, I felt that. And I think about the early conversations Christi and I used to have, this is, I can't remember how many years ago, about all of these things. And even what we were talking about this morning, about the plant, her telling me the first time about that dream, and it didn't trigger the experience that I'd had with it at the time. And then it made me remember that Peter, my old law teacher, who said to me one day when I told him, I said, I can't remember anything you've told me because I didn't write it down. And he said, oh, it's all there. I've given it to you 4 times. I can't give you any more. And I said, but I can't remember. And I was always working on the computer when I wasn't working with him. And he told me, he said, you're just like that. He said, one day, one of your students are going to ask you something. And it's just like they pushed that key. And he said, all of that stuff is going to come. And I said, well, how do I know that for sure? Well, he said, when somebody needs it, it'll be there. Otherwise, he said, why do you have to know it? And then he said, sometimes, he said, a whole bunch of stuff will come. Somebody will push, maybe accidentally, a whole bunch of them, like if she does that a lot. And he said, you'll start talking and you think, why am I saying all that? I don't even know what I'm talking about. He said, just forget about it. It's none of your business. He said, somebody is, they're talking through you. Which people find kind of hokey when you talk about it in the law college, because some of my students used to think I was a bit off the wall. But it's okay to talk about it if you go to say to a Scientology meeting or to wherever, because people do believe in mediums. There's mediums. For Indigenous people, we've always had ceremonies. That's what shaking tent is those things come in and they talk through the body of the person that's doing the ceremony. That happens to, sometime when you're running a lodge, there's a message for somebody, and the person who's running the lodge is all of a sudden you have a need to say something and you don't know why you say it, but that's for somebody else, it's not for you.
So I hope this piece does that for so many people that walk into the library.
Well, the really big piece is when somebody gives a piece, even if it's only 3 pieces, we can all be in this room and it reminds us of something. So people in conversation, when you're kiuka, you start to talk about that, and you've all put your pieces together, and you've ended up with a great big piece, and that great big piece will go out and do the same thing. So it's like teaching in any kind of a setting. Somebody, that conversation, if you can make the conversation happen in the classroom, in a place, create the space so that people, it empowers people, because you don't think you're too, we always make a joke and say, well, I'll put in my 2 cents worth. You don't think your 2 pieces are really worth that much, and who are you to think that you have that kind of wisdom? When really we do have wisdom. All of us were born with wisdom. And we're thinking about something else, where somebody had just finished working with plants, or they just finished playing with a baby, or cooking food. Gina just cooked a beautiful supper the other night. That's a ceremony. She was cooking for us because she knew that we were having these conversations, and cooked that beautiful food. So she brings that piece that we needed to be able to, and if you think about, you don't even have to be Indigenous. Think about what feasts do for people. Why do we have big Thanksgiving dinners? Why do we have big
wedding
Christmas,
feasts,
all of
birthday
these things.
feasts?
It's the way that people laugh and talk and sing and dance together and eat food
Remember
together.
who you are and where you came from.
Yeah, and where, you say that's what my great-grandmother used to do.
Well, a long time ago, if a piece of art like this ended up in a library, you would never get to have a tea and sit around and visit. You wouldn't be visiting in a library, but libraries have been transformed in the last while, that we could hope that some students would sit around and visit and talk about this space, and it changed the energy in the library. I've been visiting this library since 1989, and when I went down into that library and saw this painting, I just had my own little cry about it, because it's changed the room.
Well, this changed the room in here for the students. They'd come in and sit down, and they were told it was a ceremonial room, so everybody practically tiptoed around until they kind of get comfortable, and then they saw that, and they started talking to each other about it. What's that up there? Blah, blah, what is that supposed to be? And when I told them, I said, that's a thunderbird. That's a thunderbird woman. Well, and then tell them thunder stories. Then they have thunder stories of their own. And pretty soon they're all, well, you saw it, you were here when we did that with students. Then they leave the room, and everybody is stronger. Everybody has taken responsibility for the story, and they're now going off to go and use it in whatever way they can, and however way, because there's not this. As we were talking about this again, is that puzzle, all of those pieces that we put together, if we think about them in a really rich way, then we create this beautiful puzzle, and then we don't go home with that puzzle. That's not what we see when we go home, because you take from the story the things that you need. So you could be the lawyer, she could be the doctor, I can be the midwife. This person can be the hunter. They take out of that what they need. So the law is not the same for everybody. Everything is alive, and it's like this winter is not like last winter.
Christi, when you look at your own pieces, do you take something different out of them every time? What happens to you when you're looking at your own artwork?
I have to be away from it for a while. So when I first do it, I'm so familiar with it, and I remember every dot. So I just think, well, I'll go away from that for a while. But when I go back to it after having not seen it for a long time, then I start to say, oh, I forgot about that. It's almost like being triggered and remembering, like what Maria's saying about stories. And I think, like, when we think about this piece here, the piece that Isaac Murdoch and I did, it has so many elements, like the chickadees are there. Well, the chickadees are in a lot of the stories. And the stories are They're the, like as Maria says, they're the newspapers. And they're in a lot of the stories about, you know, that have a lot of lessons in them, and they report back, and it's great fun, you know, the chickadees, and you just picture them as those little reporters in newspapers, and then there's the dragonflies, there's the wolf, and the man standing with the pipe, and of course the wolf has you know, Nana Boozhoo and his brother, and there's all those stories, and Wasaki Chuck, and then there's the beaver. There's stories about beavers. There's stories about us marrying beavers. There's all these...
The treaties between humans and beaver.
Yeah.
That's what that was, that alliance that was formed.
Yeah. And there's treaties between, you know, the emphasis, we've seemed to have dropped off our alliances and treaties not only with animals and other beings, but even amongst ourselves. So the Métis having treaties with signing, you know, our own Iron Alliance with the Confederacy. We seem to have, it's sort of the treaties with the Canadian, well, with the Crown have usurped, or what's that word? Usurped.
The treaties we had among ourselves.
Yeah, usurped our own treaties.
We wait for that action to happen. We've become docile in lots of domesticated, colonialized,
Well, so when I think about, like, your initial question about Indigenous law, well, not your question, but the question that people have, what is Indigenous law? What is, you know, well, there's the Canadian version of Indigenous law, which is Canadian law.
Right.
It's Canadian law that
imposed.
has to do with Indigenous
It's been
people.
indigenized
right?
a little bit.
And then there's Indigenous law, which is our laws. And then there's natural laws, the laws of the earth. And our laws, Indigenous laws, are in line with the natural laws and with the sacred laws. And our sacred stories reflect those natural laws of the earth, which, as I was saying, the earth governs us, not the other way around. The earth is my government. So when I look to see what I'm to do, I have to look to the earth, and it tells us how to live. It tells us when to wake up, when to go to sleep, how to protect everything. It tells us when there's a stress in an area to leave an area alone. It tells us not to over harvest anything. The earth tells us, and we learn how to govern ourselves accordingly. And our laws are longer standing than Canadian laws. Our laws come from the beginning of time. Our laws come from the universe. So our laws are, to me, have more validity and more weight than Canadian law. And it's always in conflict, the idea that Canadian law is more important, supreme than our laws. But our laws, Indigenous laws, not just ours in the Métis Nation or our ancestry, but other nations, Indigenous nations, their laws and our laws are similar and aligned with the earth and have a lot more weight and power and will be longer lasting in the end, because the earth is more powerful than all of us combined. And she always will be. And she will regenerate, and she will continue to birth beings as miraculous as the stars. And we would be wise as a human species to get ourselves all in line with natural laws, with her laws, and with the laws of the universe, and get our own laws that we govern ourselves by back into line with those laws.
So that's just a great lesson for the students to get. One of the things that they ask always when Maria was teaching her Cree law class here is, you know, when we're upstairs, we listen to the black letter law, the Canadian laws about how the country is run and the rules around people and property. And we just absorb those, and somebody says, how do you use it? And I say, use it like this. No, you could use it more, you know, you could use it better this way or that way. And when you come and you hear stories, you say, did that really happen? Is that really how this is? And that feels a bit far-fetched, and that's just a story. How can you call it a law when that is absolutely the foundation of all Canadian law? Did it really happen that the Crown was honorable in all of its approaches to Indigenous people? Because that's the basis of treaty making and constitutionality in this country, is the honor of the Crown. So we're going to start with a lie, Which takes me back to your comments, Maria, and you, Christi, about talking about the bison and talking about the relationship between how many bison there were and how many people there were. Maria, you often teach about laws, experiences of people and all beings being wrapped into the land, and I would imagine into the water. And maybe the water's a purifier. I haven't thought about this very long, but you know, when you think about that original relationship like that with between the buffalo and the people, and how the newcomers came and we were to be eradicated. We were on the endangered species list. That was how we were just part of all the fauna and flora, and frankly written about that, like that in Jesuit diaries, right? Now we got folded into the land. Like, what are we constantly trying to detoxify the land from that mass genocide that happened? We don't talk about it like that, but if you imagine the Holocaust and you imagine the genocide of bison, we have the same pile of bones, we have the same experiences here, but we don't render that important historically because it's not white people that were murdered.
And we also live in a society where nothing is related.
Yeah.
We don't see the animals as our
Yeah.
family, and that we're, like Christi said yesterday, we're at the bottom of the pile. Nobody needs us, but we need them.
That's so true, and that's so what's powerful.
We've made ourselves the higher,
on the right top of the pyramid, right?
And also, like, think about the consequences to breaking sacred law. I mean, that's wrapped up in our stories too. There are consequences to breaking those sacred
big ones,
laws.
yeah.
You disrespect animals, you disrespect the earth the way that we're doing it, and there are consequences to that. And I'm not one to prescribe what those consequences are, or to sort of be conspiracy theorist about it, but there are definitely within our stories and within our laws teachings about what happens when we break sacred law, and you know, we need to observe those as well, because those teach us how to be respectful sometimes, you know. If we're, you know, when we're going about, for example, if a hunter or a trapper is going out on the land, and they have those teachings, they'll know what to do and what not to do, to respect the animals and to keep everything in balance. And that's really what it is. It's keeping everything in this beautiful sacred balance, so that the earth can continue to thrive and survive, and all of us with it for the next you know, thousands of years.
Well, think about our two rivers. You know, we live between the North and the South Saskatchewan River, and you know, somebody yesterday said they're talking about flooding more land in Saskatchewan, you know, building other dams or something. But you think about what the dams did on both those rivers to the Mackenzie Valley, or the Mackenzie Delta, you know, in Cumberland House area. That delta is totally drying up, and it's the biggest delta in North America, you know. So when you think about that, and you think that I'm in my 80s, so you think that my dad, 20 years before that, so that would have been 100 years ago, that my father and his family and 10 wagon loads of families came and camped by the river at Poitras, which is just a few miles from here, and that they were able to catch sturgeon that fed 10 families with all of their children, their dogs, fed them for a week, all of them. That was what they ate, berries and sturgeon.
One sturgeon.
One sturgeon. You're lucky if you find a 5-pound sturgeon in this river. You certainly never find anything more than 7 or 8 pounds. And that was, and when I was a little girl, they were still able to get sturgeon to feed lots of people. We didn't have that many. You walk along the river today, and you know, my kids will go down to the river, my grandkids, with a pail, and you know, if I want to keep them busy, I tell them to go pick clamshells. So they'll walk along the river, and it's just, there's clamshells all over. You can come up with buckets of them, clamshells that are that big. We used to eat those when I was a little girl. They were freshwater clams. And now they're laying every, you know, as the river flows, they flow to the side, and you can pick buckets of them in In a couple of hours, the kids come up with 2 buckets and then they play with them and they make
Because the
stuff out
river's
of
so
them.
low?
Because the river's so low, but also the river is so polluted. Where I live at the bottom of the creek, it's not unusual for me to go out there and chase a couple of trucks out in the summer, because that's where the people that put the chemicals in their trucks, the big trucks to spray the fields. They'll come down there and they'll wash their. They'll go in and they'll put water into the tanks, and then they put the water back in the river. So that chemical is going into the river. And you catch a fish in there, if you're lucky enough to catch one, and you touch it and your finger will go right through it. The flesh is so soft. So you've got the Mackenzie Delta that's drying up, and that's where Judge Jerry comes from. And Naomi, my young woman that I work with, her family, the carriers, are well known in North America for trying to save that delta for the last 50 years, and that's these 2 rivers, and we're going to build another dam or dam some more
And divert.
and we're the most endangered river, the South Saskatchewan
In the world, you said.
I mean, that's incredible.
That's
and we
incredible.
don't even know that. I'll bet anything that you ask any one of the students in this college, I know I have you ever been down to the river? Do you ever go over to the river? Because it's just a
5-minute walk.
walk over there. Have you ever gone down there and thought about all of the things that you're learning and think about the river? And do you know that it's the most endangered river right now? And they just glaze over. They don't know what I'm talking about. But everybody gets all in a big flap about what's happening in the Amazon, to the rivers there and the rainforest, and don't realize that you can drive between here and the area in the west side where I grew up. It looks like it's all forested, but if you walk within a few hundred yards off of the road, the trees are the front, but you walk beyond that and it's all clear cut. Like literally, it's not just clear cut, it's been mulched, which means that all of the little plants won't ever come back again, and all of those little bugs have died.
Think about the students that go here. They'll be getting careers in a variety of law practices. Some of them will be acting for the government. They'll be getting jobs with the government of Saskatchewan or the federal government, and it's really important that people's sense of love and preciousness for the areas that they love, even a little bend in a river or something, it's really important that they come to understand not just Indigenous perspectives, because I'm not asking anybody to necessarily adopt those, but to really understand their own love for the river and the history of the river.
Of place.
Of place,
Yeah.
the connection to it, and to understand that they have a responsibility to understand the river from the life-giving, value that it has to everything.
Yeah. Whether you're a farmer or you're a trapper or you're whatever,
A
you
business
should know,
person downtown.
You have to
need
know your responsibility to that river and what your obligations are if you want to keep it. If you want to keep harvesting it, otherwise you can't harvest it anymore. It's eventually you're not going to be able to do that. How does it? My dad knew everything about the river because he trapped on it. He was a trapper. You knew everything. You knew all the plants. You knew how important those plants were to the beaver and the muskrat that were there.
That traditional teaching of connectedness you've said already is so gone. And we have grocery stores that we get our food from. We take people to the hospital when they're sick. Funeral homes look after our dead. We don't have connections. We go to the hospital to have babies. We're disconnected from our own human birthing and lifing cycles, and food harvesting. Like the only thing that sustains you while you're a creature on the planet is harvesting food, and we're so disconnected from how that is, and we actually aren't even eating food mostly anymore. We're eating some processed canned something, right? And so it's an interesting thing as people the health movement is so strong and the environmental movements are so strong, and you're starting to get this large non-Indigenous audience at places like Standing Rock and in these other places, and it's like, oh, I suddenly feel connected.
But until people understand that that river or that plant or that bug is the same as my kinship to my children and my grandchildren, that it's the same thing. It doesn't matter how environmental you get, it doesn't mean anything, because you'll fight to the death to protect your children, but you won't fight to the death to protect your relative, the water.
Mm-hmm.
You know? How many people know that water is your first protector? That you come from wherever, from the mystery, you come into the body of a woman, and that
Water.
You know, from that place to here, because this is your transition place to the physical, that you're surrounded by water, and that's your first protector.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And that menstrual blood is what nurtures you for that 9 months, and you had to baptize babies to clean them of that blood, because it was considered unclean, and as a result women were unclean.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's all of these just horrible things that are attached to it that have totally warped our way of seeing and thinking. We don't understand birthing, or which is a part of dying, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that there's those two old ladies, one of them catches you when you're born and the other one catches you when you leave to go home. That's their job at each end.
Mm-hmm.
And in between there is all of us and the plants. And
I was thinking about the Saskatchewan's plan to divert the water for agriculture, and how, you know, it's like Lake Winnipeg, you know, like the phosphorus and all of that from runoff from the farms is creating this imbalance in the water, giving a temporary boom to the fishing industry, and then it's going to crash, is what they expect, because as these things grow, it's smothering out the oxygen. So it's like that. You can give a temporary, if you're diverting water from an already very low river to expand or provide water to agriculture, at some point that's going to crash. And when that does crash, then who suffers is everyone, because we rely on our farmers for food. We need the farms, and we need that. So, and the farmers need to have a living, and they need to have their ability to continue to grow food for the population. So we need to think about something that's sustainable, like water capture systems from the environment, which are already in existence. There are people who have invented that. They know how to do it. You can simply set these things up and they capture water right out of the air. It doesn't even have to be a rainy day, you know. And we have to think about progressing because the population is growing, and we are not necessarily reaching a crisis where we're not going to be able to sustain everything if we're smart about it. Canada has not been smart with its progress on green technology. It could be converting tar sands, dirty tar sands, exploitation of land, and providing new green technology, learning, training, production. Canada could become a leader in how to do sustainable practices for agriculture, for everything. It could, because it's already being practiced around the world in different places. We could become a leader in not using Monsanto chemicals or glyphosate, spraying our forests with glyphosate, with aerial spraying to support forestry industry. These are not sustainable, and the insatiable sort of greed of capitalism just keeps chomping everything down. It just goes and goes and goes, and it never ends. And we have the ability, we're smart enough, we're brilliant enough as human beings to be able to do it. And so there's hope there, but it's like we're battling against the beast of capitalism, which is run by corporate capitalism, and it's doing its own thing, and it wants the river.
And even if they change, how do you change the institutions where it's just a part of even the floor, of all the mortar and...
I think that
So it has to be thought of holistically.
Holistically, and from when people are children, I think the Canadian education system does a disservice to Canadians. They don't teach full pictures of things. They're teaching right from the get-go that Canada is filled with resources, and that alone, just that alone, resources, is a mindset that needs to be eradicated from our way of thinking.
I think there's a resource that we saw in a young girl at the presentation yesterday as well, and I would imagine in the work that you've been doing and the painting that you've done publicly on buildings and in streets that you've seen some young folks come out that just get it. You don't have to start from scratch with them. They just absolutely understand and know. Her mother sent me an email last night and said, can you please pass on to Maria and Christi what a joyful time it was and how special my daughter was made to have that much time from both of you to answer her question. Just an earnest young girl growing into a woman saying, what can we do? What's our role? And wanting one. You know, I work with elders a lot and they say, give responsibility back to children. They are aching for it. And she came right out and asked you for it yesterday. It was beautiful.
I feel really bad for the coming generations. Like, I remember Autumn Pelche in a ceremony that we had about water, and everyone had broken off into groups and then presented back to the elders what our solutions, we thought our solutions were going to be. And then they were to deliberate on those ideas that we had, to take action. And Autumn said, she was crying in front of them, and she said, why is it my responsibility as a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old? She says, why do I have to worry about this? You know, why does this fall on my shoulders? You know, and that really affected everybody. I mean, we all, there wasn't a person who didn't have a tear in their eye because we felt it, you know. And I thought to myself, it isn't your responsibility. You're a child. It's ours. And as long as we have a breath in our body, we can still fight for it.
Well, we forget that our teachings tell us that the most important people in our world is children, because children are the future, and everything we do is inherited by them. And it's true. Why should that be their inheritance? Like, we're not responsible for. Well, I think about all the times when we do openings and even in classroom, tell students, okay, put your children in, how many of you have babies? Put them in the middle of this room and then let's talk about laws and stories. You look at them differently when you think that this is what you're passing on to your child. We're talking about song, that song is the beginning of something, or putting, you know, that's the signing of the treaty or whatever. And I used to do documentary films, and one of the places that I did a film was Cumberland House, and that was like about 35 years ago. And I went out, because it was the first time that the elders were actually filming what was happening with the river and with the delta. And this old man was in his 80s, and I was out on a boat with him, and we had the crew out there, and he was checking his nets, and as he was bringing his nets in, and I've seen my dad do that, but you see it so often that you don't think about it. But I was watching him from a kind of a different lens, and as he was bringing his net in, he was almost talking to himself, and he was saying, "Kinoseo, baby, the way." He was talking to the fish as he was bringing them in, but it was almost a little song under his breath. And so when we got back, we listened to it to see if we had it, and so when we had the rough cut finished, and we took it back to the community, and we were showing it to the people, and I asked that old man, I said, would you talk about what you were doing in there? And he said, I didn't even know I was doing it. He said, I do it all the time since I was a little boy, and I don't even know when I'm doing it. Like it became such a habit that he was he was acknowledging that those fishes, he was bringing them in and doing that little thing that's part of treaty making with them. And,
And honoring of taking that life.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But when we were finished and we were going back to shore, and he was talking, because he was like, I was interviewing him, but we were doing it like this. We were talking, and just him talking about the land. It was like whatever happened between him and those fish took him to another place that he had to talk about, and he was able to. I think our interview went far into the night. That one. But it was the first time I think that I had ever thought about of that exchange happening, because we saw it all the time when we were hunting in the fall or in the summer with my dad. But he would. It was you never thought about other people doing it, or that it meant anything other than it was just some peculiarity with our dad, and to hear this old man doing that.
I think what's so lovely about some of our ways too is how we take pains not to offend, and the way that we treat, even if we understand that the animals are giving their lives to save our own or to nourish ourselves, we also take pains not to offend in that process. And if we do, there is the idea of setting things right, So, for example, I remember one time I was out with some friends, and somebody had caught something that they, accidentally shouldn't have caught, and they had to put it back on the land with tobacco, and really talk to that and try and set that right, and say, because our belief sometimes is that maybe that would cause sickness, or maybe that would cause something later on. That idea that there are consequences to what we do. The idea of setting things right again, providing offerings. That you don't set things right by simply talking. You have to give back. You have to...
You have to have conciliation.
Yes, so when we're talking about balance, we're talking about actual giving back. So when you were speaking about reconciliation, that word really has come to bother me because of how tokenized it is and how empty it's become. And it's become almost like just by saying the word, that becomes the action. And it's not. We don't. And as Maria says, in our language, we don't have a word for reconciliation. We only have a word for setting things right.
For conciliation, yeah.
And so, if we do that, if we are to set things right, the first thing I think about is our land, because the entire country of Canada was created by the eradication of Indigenous people from our lands, by pushing us off of our lands, by obtaining our lands, by unscrupulous and unethical means, by doing whatever was necessary to get the land. And so for me, that's the foundation of everything. And so reconciliation can't be possible.
Because reconciliation means you go back to that good relationship you had.
Yes, and if you
never had it.
If you never had it, how can you?
It's reconciling.
So what you do is
doing
you
it
just
again.
say, okay, this is what we did. This is what happened. Now,
Yeah, what are we going back to? Colonization or your early contact?
so what we need to do is, okay, we can't do anything about that, but we can do something about right now. So we make that right.
And if we're setting things
Because
right, then we have to get our land back.
Yeah. Because what can you do besides say you're sorry? And what does sorry mean? Doesn't mean nothing.
Or,
we don't even
or do
have that word.
what treaty are we on? I'd like to do a land treaty. We're on Treaty 6, right? That what are we doing with those? And then you get the words out, and you can hear institutional recognition. Every staff has the same 4 lines that they come out with this, and it's like, it's so
Vapid.
yeah.
It makes me laugh too, because one time I was in this I had to do a talk with these teachers, and they were about 150 of them, and they got up and they did the land acknowledgement. And my friend was sitting right beside me, and it was her territory that we were on, you know, and they acknowledged the land of the Mississaugas, and my friend was just sitting there like, sort of, you know, it was an empty thing. And I got up and I thought, just a little bit further, you're almost there. Like, and we acknowledge the land of the Mississaugas, and we're going to work to give it back to the Mississauga people. You know, like, it's just like, it's almost there. I was telling Ryan McMahon once, I was like, it's like, you know, somebody came and took your truck, and then they're driving around in your truck, and they pass you on the road walking, and your shoes are like, have holes in them, and you're like struggling walking, and they're like, they pass you on the road, and they're like, hey, how's it going, man? It's like, dude, you got my truck. It's like, give me my truck back. It's like, no, I acknowledge this was your truck. I acknowledge this was your truck, but I'm out to a meeting. See ya. You know, and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? You know, it's funny.
Here, I'll give him my shoes. I'll take them off.
Give me my shoes. We good? We good? Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. What's the action? And you know, within the classes that Maria is teaching here, that was always the question, like, what do we do with this now? How do we, because you can't unknow. Once you get the picture of interconnectedness, and it's like, you know, all my relations, XA, all my relations. Well, what does that actually mean? And how am I related to a beaver? And what is, once you actually start to see that, you know, you can study mice and wolves and know that when the mice population goes down, the wolf population goes down, and when the wolf population is coming back up, this one's coming back up, and how easy it is to interfere with that little tiny cycle right there. We never put humans in those cycles to see where are the booms and where are the busts in our population, in our health, in our resiliency, another overused word. And these images, because even where there's no colored picture, the black is so rich and so night sky-ish and so pulls you into it. And so walking into the law library, I was listening to the commentary last night, and it was like, that damn painting pulls you to it. And it was like, oh yeah, there's some magic going on in there. It needs to. It's calling you for a reason. So
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I really hope that's the impression.
I wanted the students, like I was saying, I wanted the students to be able to be in their computers and their studies and everything, and just take a rest for their eyes for a moment. You know, when you look off, but you're in your mind, you're not actually seeing anything, you're only seeing what's in your mind. And I hope that when their eyes just rest, they don't just subliminally, they will, you know, that will go into them, and somehow it will, you know, their connections. Everybody has a connection to a frog or a bird or something. They have something in their childhood that they can remember, and that they will go to that place of being whole and wholesome, because wholesomeness is something we kind of miss. I miss wholesomeness in this world, you know, the innocence of things.
Thank you both. That was really fun, and I'm personally so grateful for the piece. And so, just personally want to say how grateful I am that you've left footprints on the hearts and the minds of the law students here, and how important I think it is, and how timely I think it is. So thank you, Christi.
Thank you.
And my best storyteller that I ever get to teach with and learn from, I just want to say thank you.